Hello girls, today I will be explaining to you a theory of development which places cognition at its center. So, before I begin the theory, I would just like to explain to you what is meant by cognitive development. Cognitive theory is concerned with the development of a person's thought processes. Cognition includes all the mental processes such as thinking, remembering, attention, perception, memory, all these are thought processes. It also looks at how these thought processes influence how we understand and interact with the world. So, these are the basic principles underlying cognitive theory. We will now look at one of the most important and influential theories of development. In fact, I would say this is the theory of development, as we call them grand theories, which includes Freud's, and this theory was outlined in the early 1920s by a Swiss biologist, Jean Piaget. He spent all his life observing children, and he was fascinated by the differences he saw in children in the way they think. In the 1920s, when he first outlined his theory, there was not much in which had been done in this field, either in the field of child development or in cognitive processes. Children were thought to be miniature adults, and no one really knew that children are different from adults. They were treated as miniature adults. Piaget, through his observations, challenged this notion, and he came out with a statement which seems very obvious to us today, but at that time was a very radical thought. His statement was that children think differently from adults. Their way of thinking is different than adults. We all know that now, but a lot of it is due to the work of Jean Piaget. He spent all his life observing children, starting with his own 3 children and going on to conduct various experiments on children. He used the clinical interview method to go into the head of children to find out what were their dreams, what were their thoughts, and what were their feelings, and he used them to develop this theory of cognitive development. He called himself a genetic epistemologist, one who studies how children gain knowledge about the world as they grow up. He spent almost 50 years observing children. Piaget asserted that children actively explore the world around them. This interaction with the environment and maturation gradually alters the way children think. So, he believed that both maturation, that is the timing for development, which is genetic, and the environment interact together to produce behavior. Children progress in their thinking through the complementary processes of assimilation and accommodation. First, we will look at the process of cognitive development. If you look at the diagram, we can see that the child passes through stages of equilibrium and disequilibrium. Equilibrium is a state of balance, is a steady state. Now, when the child comes across a new idea or experiences something for the first time, he or she experiences disequilibrium. She is confused, she does not know whether what she is thinking is right, and so she seeks confirmation of her thoughts from somebody. I will explain to you these concepts. So, when she uses assimilation and accommodation, by the use of these 2 mechanisms, she comes back to a new state of balance or a new state of equilibrium. And now, she has added to her repertoire that 4-legged creatures can be dogs, they can also be cats. And that is how slowly she develops ideas about the world around her. So, this is the basic process of cognitive development. Now, let us look at some of the basic concepts and try to understand what Piaget meant them to be. The basic concept that a child has an idea about something, he called it a schema or schemes, as some people use the modern language usage as schemes. A schema describes both the mental and physical actions involved in understanding and knowing. Schemas are categories of knowledge that help us to interpret and to understand the world around us. So, you may have a schema of a dog, you may have a schema of a teacher, you may have a schema of a table, you may have a schema of eating, whatever it is. So, these include mental ideas as well as physical operations. So, we have schemas about various objects, events and people in our world. Assimilation and accommodation are two of the processes which are constantly happening to bring about equilibrium in the child's disturbed world. Assimilation involves interpreting new experiences in terms of existing mental structures without changing them. So, it involves changing your existing structure of four-legged creatures, which are not only dogs, but can also be cats or horses or cows. Okay. So, the process of assimilation is first you take it in within the structure which you already have, the schema which you have of four-legged creatures. Then you have to broaden that, you have to accommodate the new information, and in the accommodation your concept is broadened, your schema of four-legged creatures is broadened to include both dog as well as cat. All children try to strike a balance between assimilation and accommodation, which is achieved through a mechanism called equilibration. This explains how children move from one stage to another. Piaget also outlined several stages through which children pass as they learn to develop their cognitive processes. And he says they go through a stage of disequilibrium, and then they accommodate all the new information, and then they remain like that for some period of time, and again you experience disequilibrium, and so on it goes, and you have these qualitative changes at each stage which mark these stages and make them different from each other. So, children think differently at different stages. Piaget proposed that the youngsters progress through four major stages of development, as I said, which have fundamentally different thought processes, each one of them. According to Piaget, the stages, the four stages are structured wholes. They do not come part by part, they are structured wholes that emerge from and transform a previous stage. So, you have the first stage from which emerges the second stage, and it transforms. That means, once you have gone from the first stage to the second stage, you can no longer be what you were in the first stage. It has been transformed. And then when you move to the third stage, you can no longer be what you were in the first stage and the second stage. Now, you are at a qualitatively different stage of development, cognitive development. He also believed that these stages follow an invariant and universal pattern. That means, everyone goes through these stages in the same sequence, stage 1, 2, 3 and 4. And he believed that these changes occur in children all over the world in the same manner. That is what he meant by universal. He also said that children proceed from an unstable period of transition into a final stable period. Briefly, the four stages of development are: the first stage is the sensorimotor period, which is from birth to 2 years. This stage is marked by the discovery of the relationship between sensation and motor behavior. The young baby is experiencing the world through its senses, through his or her senses, and it is born with certain motor activities which are known as reflexes, which later become refined to become true movements or true motor activities. The second period is the pre-operational period from 2 to 7 years. In this stage, the children use symbols to represent objects internally in their heads, especially through the use of language, which is a tool for thinking. The concrete operational period from 7 to 11 years is marked by the mastery of logic and development of rational thinking. The last stage is the formal operational period from 11 through adulthood, which involves the development of abstract and hypothetical thinking. Let us now look at them a little more in detail. The first stage is the sensorimotor period, and as the name suggests, it involves a coordination of sensory input and motor responses. The child is born with certain reflexes such as sucking, crying, movement of the body, and it is experiencing the world through its senses. So, there is a coordination between the two. This stage is marked by many changes, and one of the most important changes is the development of object permanence. Object permanence develops when a child recognizes that objects continue to exist even when they are no longer visible. This was one of the well-known experiments carried out in children to develop this concept, to show this concept, to demonstrate this. When you see very young children, you show them an object, they look at it and they even get excited about it, but the moment it goes out of their sight, which could be when it falls down or even goes on, to the side, the child does not turn its head or does not look down to search for that object. It ceases to exist for the child. As long as it is in front of her, she knows that it exists, but she still does not understand that an object can exist even if it is not in front of your eyes. But slowly through this stage, she learns to do that. The next stage is the pre-operational period, in which the most important thing is the development of symbolic thought. That means, you can see something and you can represent it in your mind in the form of a word or in the form of an image. Okay. So, language development is one of the hallmarks of this period. Children spend a lot of time in play and pretending, and therefore, role play becomes very important. You will see this at this age, children are playing pretend games. They pretend to have a house, to play mummy, daddy, or they are in a hospital and there is a doctor and nurse, or the teacher and student. They get great pleasure in pretending and playing roles. There are three concepts in this stage which we need to understand: irreversibility, the inability to envision reversing an action. When something happens, the children cannot imagine that it can go back. Then they also have a belief in animism, that is, the belief that all things are living. So, they will believe some doll to be their sister or their mother or whatever it is. Okay? And another very common thing which can be observed in children of this age is egocentrism, thinking which is characterized by a limited ability to share another person's viewpoint. So, a child is egocentric. When we say that, we mean that she believes she is the center of the universe and everything happens around her. The child places herself at the center of the universe, and she is able to look at the world from her viewpoint, but she is unable to take in the viewpoint of another person. And this was very well demonstrated in one of Piaget's famous experiments, which is known as the 3 mountains experiment, in which on a table they have shown 3 mountains, a clay model of 3 mountains, and a child is sitting on one side and she is asked, what do you see? And she is shown some pictures and she points out to the view which she gets from her side. Then she is asked, suppose you imagine that another person is sitting on that side, which view will that person have? And she is shown certain different views, but she points out to the same view which she is looking at, rather than the view which the person from the other side. The other side, the person will be having a different view, but she is not able to see that. She feels that the other person also has the same view as she is having. So, that is what is meant by egocentrism, the inability to take another's perspective, to think that there can be another perspective. We will now look at another thing which the child is not able to do at this stage, but which he masters in the next stage, that is the ability to conserve. And this again has been demonstrated in various areas. For example, the conservation of number, the conservation of length, and the conservation of quantity. So, we will first look at the conservation of length. If you look at the picture, you can see that when the experimenter presented the children with 2 strings of the same length and asked the child which string is longer, the children recognized that both the strings were of the same length, but when it was brought into a crescent form, they were not able to say whether it was of the same length. So, when it becomes in the form of a crescent, they believe that it changes, though it is the same string which has been brought into a crescent form. But when it changes, they are not able to think that it is the same thing which has been changed. They are not able to conserve the property of the string as the same. Next, we look at the conservation of number. When children are presented with 2 rows of checkers, as is shown in the diagram, they are then asked if there are more in one or the other row, or if they are the same number in both the rows. The children recognize that it is the same in both the rows. Then the experimenter rearranges the checkers intentionally. Now, when the child is asked which is more or are they the same, many of them answered that there are more of the pink or red ones. So, when you change it, they are not able to understand that the same thing can be changed and they remain the same even if they are changed. So, this is the inability to conserve, whether it is length or number, or as we look at the next one, quantity. This experiment uses 2 glasses of water in which there are equal amounts of liquid, and when the children are asked, they report that it is the same. Now, if you take another different shaped container and pour the liquid from one of the long containers into the shallow container, and you ask the child, is it the same amount? The child will say, no, the one in the longer one is more and the one in the shallow one is less, though the same amount has been poured into the shallow container. So, again this demonstrates the inability to conserve, which develops in the next stage. Now, we come to the next stage of development, cognitive development, which is the concrete operational period. In this stage, the children gain a better understanding of mental operations. They are able to think much better than they were earlier, and their thinking is restricted to concrete things, things which are in front of them, which they can touch, which they can sense, which they can feel. In this stage, there is a development and mastery of conservation, which we looked at earlier, which was not there in the previous one, reversibility, that one thing can be another and come back to another, and also they develop the processes of classification, that an object can be added to other objects to form a class of things. Okay? Like for example, a dog can be added to the other things like a horse and a cow and a cat, and together they make up a class of things which are animals. Earlier they are not able to do that. And also they develop seriation, which is the ability to think of things not in one dimension, but as having more than one dimension. They are now fairly good at the use of inductive logic, but they still have some difficulty understanding abstract or hypothetical concepts. Everything is tied to the concrete, to what exists in some form or the other. But if you ask them to think what will happen if you do this, the consequences of some action, they are still not able to think very clearly, which will come later in the next stage. We will now examine the fourth stage of development, which is the formal operational period. This is the culmination of cognitive thinking according to Piaget, and in this stage the adolescent can now reason in abstract ways, in idealistic ways and logical ways. Step by step he or she is able to reason and think. So, logical thought, deductive reasoning and systematic planning emerge during this stage. Mental operations which were till now tied to the concrete can now be applied to abstractions. They are able to solve any problem in their head, and they are able to think of the consequences of what would happen if I did this. This would happen if I did this. They are able to think abstractly and logically. As I said, children go through these stages in an invariant sequence, and if we were to sum up these 4 stages, I would just like to give you an example which will explain this clearly. You imagine that we have a big tub of water and a lot of small objects of different shapes, sizes, height, color and density. We will take these 2 things and we will look at what a child does with this through the 4 stages of development. This will help us to understand the different ways in which children think. So, suppose we give these 2 things, this set of objects, small objects and a tub of water to an infant. What do you think that infant is going to do with it in the sensorimotor period? She may splash in the water, she may throw the things, she may push the things to the bottom of the tub, okay? And she doesn't do much beyond that. She may even try to bring it to her mouth and eat those objects. These are the sensory motor activities which an infant is able to do with these things. If we go on to the pre-operational child, the child is now more interested in knowing about these objects. So, she will try to see what is happening with these different objects, and she will develop some idea that some of those objects are sinking. Okay, the light objects will obviously stay afloat and the heavy ones will sink. So, she will just merely observe it, but she will not be too much bothered about what is happening. And she will also, what they do at this stage is, whatever the objects given, maybe they will start imagining that these are boats and fish and start playing with them in the tub of water, because this is the age in which they have imagination, animism, that is they try to imagine that this thing has life and is something, and so they will do all these things, but they are not much bothered about anything else. Now, when we go on to the 3rd stage, concrete operation stage, at this stage some of the inconsistencies in what is happening to those objects start bothering the child. She will start wondering, why is it that some objects float and some objects sink, and she will try to understand, but her thinking will still not be very systematic. She will just develop some concept of maybe sinkability, that some things sink and some things float, that is all. It is not very systematic. Now, it is only when we come to the last stage, that is the formal operational stage, that the child will have a strategy and a plan to find out what is happening and why this is happening with these objects. So, she will have a set of hypotheses which she will test. So, she will vary all the factors to see what is happening, and she may come to a conclusion based on it, based on the results of her experiments with those objects, and she will now come to a conclusion that this object is light and small and therefore, it floats. This object is heavy. She will have a hypothesis which she will test, and she will come to a conclusion. So, these are the different changes which take place in the way the children think and the way they apply their thought processes to the environment around them.
Ma'am, do these stages occur in children across all cultures?
Piaget did believe that these stages are universal, that they occur in the same manner across all cultures. But later studies have shown cultural variations, and that is one of the criticisms of his theory, that it is it is not universal, the cognitive development.
We have seen children of 9 and 10 also thinking abstractly. How is that possible?
Well, that is also another criticism of Piaget's theory. Many people feel that what he outlines at a later stage is seen in very much children who are much younger. Well, abstract thinking could be seen in children of 9 to 10 years also. One thing is that it may not be truly abstract thinking, but another is that in today's world we may see that these things, changes in cognitive development occur at an earlier stage than what Piaget outlined. So, summing up, we can see that Piaget's theory of cognitive development is one of the grand theories of development. It recognized the role of cognition in development. He also discovered surprising features of young children's thinking. He discovered through his observations of children that children think not only about profound things such as the origin of the universe, but they also think about solving problems such as how to open the door when they are holding something and not dropping it. They may worry or think about moral development, or they may worry about some other things. So, many surprising things came out of his examination of children's thinking. His theory provided a framework for understanding the richness and the complexity of young children's thinking and of cognitive development. As one of the psychologists put it, Jean Piaget was a giant in the nursery. Thank you.